2025 has honestly been a mixed year for Indian cinema. On one hand, we have seen these small, underrated films come out of nowhere and turn into massive blockbusters. And on the other hand, some of the most hyped, star-studded projects, the ones everyone expected to dominate the box office, have stumbled pretty badly, whether in storytelling, execution, or just failing to connect with audiences.
You're goddamn right.
In this video, I'm counting down my personal top 10 most disappointing Indian movies of 2025, and I really want to stress the word disappointing, not worst. These aren't necessarily the worst made films of the year. They are the ones that let me down the most compared to what I had expected. For context, I have chosen movies from my own most awaited Indian movies of 2025 list, which I published earlier this year. If your favorites show up here, don't take it personally. We can totally disagree and still have a great discussion. Use this video as a starting point to talk about what worked or didn't work for you. With that food for thought, let's dive into my top 10 most disappointing Indian movies of 2025, starting with Vidda Muyarchi. Now, just because this is the least disappointing on my list doesn't mean it worked fully for me. With Ajit teaming up with Mazes Tirumeni, I was expecting a sharp, tightly written thriller with real psychological depth. The build-up around this film was massive, and this could have been Ajit's most interesting films in recent times. What we finally got though felt strangely uneven. There were flashes of the film, a few well-staged sequences, a moody atmosphere, and some nicely staged moment for Ajit, but overall the writing never fully came together. The story kept promising big reveals and emotional payoffs that either came too late or didn't land with enough impact. The pacing dipped in key places, and the thriller angle never became as tight or gripping as it should have been. So Vidda Muyarchi isn't a disaster, and it's definitely more watchable than some of the other titles on this list. But compared to what this combo could have delivered, it still left me wanting a lot more. Next on my list is Thamma, which is a bit of a tricky one because I don't think it's a bad film at all, but it is disappointing when you look at what it represents for the Maddock horror comedy universe. The MHCU has given us genuine surprises like Stree and Munjia, and Thamma was positioned as the most expensive, most crucial bridge film in the franchise, leading us towards a big two-part Mahayuddh in 2028. On the positive side, it's the most technically polished film in the MHCU so far. The Betal Rem looks fantastic, the VFX during transformations are solid, and there's a standout action sequence with a returning fan favorite that really pops. Ayushmann Khurrana is reliably good, and for me, Rashmika Mandanna gives the film's best performance as Tadka, a very tricky, non-human role that she handles with great control and commitment. The disappointment comes from the writing and pacing. The film keeps mixing Indian Betal folklore with Western vampire tropes and ends up making the mythology feel confused and generic. The rules it establishes are interesting but only briefly explored. The central romance never fully clicks, the comedy is very hit or miss, and the flow is badly hurt by unnecessary songs that drag the film out. So for the MHCU, Thamma is an important piece of the puzzle, but as a standalone movie, it feels like a bloated, slightly confused set of film that doesn't quite live up to the potential of its world or its cast. Next is Ghaati. On paper, this had a lot going for it. Anushka Shetty in a fierce central role, Vikram Prabhu making his Tollywood debut, Jagapati Babu, Chaitanya Rao, and the backing of the First Frame Entertainments with UV Creations presenting. You expect a solid, moody action crime drama with emotional weight and strong character moments. And to be fair, some things do work. Anushka once again commands the screen in several scenes, especially in the action portions where her aggression feels convincing, but the story just wasn't strong enough. The film has all the ingredients: action, love, revenge, but the screenplay is flat and predictable. There's very little grip in the narration, and the second half, which had scope for a powerful emotional payoff, never really lands. Character arcs feel abrupt and underdeveloped, and even central roles like Anushka's deserved much stronger writing. On top of that, the heavy obvious CGI used to de-age Anushka becomes distracting instead of impressive. So Ghaati ends up as a classic case of good casting and decent moments trapped inside a weak, familiar script. Next is Deva.
I am Mafia.
When this film was announced with Shahid Kapoor and Roshan Andrews, I was quietly optimistic. Shahid has been choosing intense, character-driven roles lately, and Andrews has proven he can handle both thrillers and drama. What made it even more intriguing was that Deva was a remake of Andrew's own Malayalam masterpiece, Mumbai Police. I was expecting a sharp, gritty action thriller, perhaps with a fresh take for the Hindi audience. But Deva turned out to be surprisingly conventional and frankly forgettable. The biggest issue for me was the screenplay. In Mumbai Police, the shocking assassination of a police officer happens right at the start, immediately hooking the audience and making them emotionally invested. Deva, however, delayed that crucial event, and by the time it arrived, the initial emotional connection was already lost. This single change in narrative structure completely defanged the film. Despite Shahid Kapoor's committed performance, the script felt generic. The action was competent but uninspired, and the emotional beats, which should have anchored the narrative, felt forced. It's a perfect example of how even a strong cast, good direction, and a proven premise can't save a film if the screenplay is weak. Deva promised intensity and originality but delivered a rather bland experience, proving that sometimes even remaking your own masterpiece can go wrong. Next up, L2 Empuraan. After Lucifer, which did a great job of blending political drama, mass moments, and a mystery around Mohanlal's character, my expectations for Empuraan were very high. This was sold as a deeper dive into Stephen's past, with an even larger canvas and more complex world building. What L2 delivered was big in scale but not always in impact. You can see the ambition, more locations, more characters, a bigger universe, but the story often felt stretched and scattered. Instead of a tight, gripping political thriller, it sometimes played like a long set of future installments. The central character didn't get as strong or focused an arc this time, and the emotional weight Lucifer had just wasn't as sharp.
What can you tell us about Empuraan?
That's just one of those another commercial films.
There are still solid moments, some well-executed sequences, and Mohanlal's undeniable screen presence, which is why this isn't at the very top of my disappointment list. But as a sequel to a hugely loved film, Empuraan didn't hit as hard as it should have. It felt more like a bridge than a complete, satisfying chapter. Next up, Game Changer. Back in January, I had already expressed doubts about this one. The trailer made it clear that Shankar was once again tackling corruption and politics, territory he's lived in for decades now, and I said it looked like another tale of deceit and corruption, a theme that was starting to feel tired. Sadly, the final film proved those fears right. Game Changer felt like Shankar trying to recreate his own older films without updating them for today's audience. The politics are oversimplified, the solutions to corruptions are almost childish, and the tone swings between serious and cartoonish. In 2025, when real-life politics is already crazier than fiction, this kind of simplistic fantasy was very hard to land. Ram Charan tries his best, but his character is inconsistently written, and even the dual role element doesn't add much depth. The first half drags with a routine love track, and the second half leans on tried tropes instead of genuine tension or innovation. For a Shankar-Ram Charan combo, this should have been a milestone film. Instead, it ends up as a reminder of how far behind Shankar's style has fallen.
I'm unpredictable.
Next, Sikandar. With a title like Sikandar and a star like Salman Khan, this was clearly pitched as a big, swagger-filled event film. The expectation was simple. If not a great film, at least a thoroughly entertaining, larger-than-life experience with strong set pieces, whistle-worthy moments, and the story that keeps you hooked enough for a theatrical watch. Instead, Sikandar felt like a very tired version of Salman Khan formula. Yes, the scale was big, the action sequences were mounted on a grand level, and there were attempts at emotions and patriotism. But it all felt like copy-paste from older films without the energy or freshness those earlier films had. The plot was extremely predictable, the villain forgettable, and even Salman himself seemed to be running on autopilot in many scenes. There were isolated moments where his charm came through, but not enough to lift the whole film. For a movie called Sikandar, it didn't conquer anything, not the box office in a big way, not the critics, and definitely not expectations. That gap between what it could have been and what it ended up being is why it ranks high on this disappointment list. Moving into the really painful territory now, Thug Life. A Mani Ratnam film with Kamal Haasan in the lead is a sort of combination that automatically raises expectations to the sky. You don't expect just a good film, you expect something special. The hope was for a rich, character-driven crime drama, maybe something that redefined the gangster underworld genre in Tamil cinema once again. But Thug Life never quite found its soul. It had all the external markers of a Mani Ratnam film, moody visuals, stylish staging, strong supporting cast, but the core felt strangely hollow. The story was more convoluted than complex, the character motivations weren't as sharply etched, and even Kamal's character lacked the emotional depth and clear arc you would expect in a collaboration of this scale. Some moments and scenes worked, but as a whole, it lacked the cohesion and emotional pull of a Mani Ratnam film. For any other director, this might have been seen as a decent, flawed film, but for this combo, it was undeniably a letdown, which is why it sits so high in the list. Next, Coolie. Rajnikant, directed by Lokesh Kanagaraj, was for many of us a dream combination. Lokesh has been on a run, building his own gritty universe and giving us some of the most exciting commercial films in recent years. The hope with Coolie was that he would channel that energy into a darker, more grounded Rajni film, something that respects his superstardom but roots it in a strong, intense story. Instead, Coolie felt like a film at war with itself. On one side, you could see Lokesh trying to bring in his grounded, gritty style. On the other hand, there was the pressure to deliver a full-blown, fan service-heavy Rajni vehicle. The result was a film that never fully committed to either. The narrative jumped around, the emotional beats didn't always land, and Rajni's character felt more like a collection of moments than a solid, well-written role. There were glimpses of what this film could have been, and those glimpses are exactly what makes it frustrating. Coolie wasn't a total failure, but with this team, decent in parts is not just good enough. That mismatch between expectation and outcome makes it one of the biggest disappointments of the year. And finally, the film that disappointed me the most in 2025, War 2. This was arguably one of the biggest event films of the year on paper. Hrithik Roshan returning as Kabir, Ayan Mukherjee directing, and Junior NTR joining the virus spy universe as a major antagonist. The tiny teaser attached to Tiger 3 had already sent expectations through the roof. This wasn't just meant to be a sequel, it was positioned as the next big leap for the entire spy franchise. But when War 2 was released, it felt like a textbook example of how scale and casting alone can't save weak writing. The showdown between Hrithik and Junior NTR should have been electric. Two strong personalities, two different styles, clashing ideologically and emotionally. Instead, it mostly stayed at the level of posing, slow motion entries, and generic one-liners. There was very little genuine tension or unpredictability in their conflict. The plot was overstuffed with universe building and setups for future films, but undercooked for this film's own story. Emotional beats didn't land, twists were either obvious or underwhelming, and the action, while big, rarely felt fresh or inventive. With this cast, this budget, and this level of hype, War 2 had every opportunity to redefine the Hindi action blockbuster. Instead, it turned out to be the most disappointing film for me in 2025. It's not the worst film of the year, but in terms of how far it fell from what it should have been, nothing else comes close. And that wraps up my list of the top 10 most disappointing Indian movies of 2025. It's always tough when films you are genuinely excited for don't quite hit the mark. But don't worry, it wasn't all doom and gloom this year. In my next video, I'll be flipping the script and sharing my top 10 big good surprises of 2025. Those underrated gems and unexpected blockbusters that truly blew me away. If you enjoyed this deep dive and are interested in watching more, check out a video on the most anticipated movies of 2026 right here. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.